Cyclones, COVID-19, and teacher strikes are causing New Zealand's economy to collapse. A 2023 quarterly report showed that the Kiwi State's economy contracted by 0.1%. The country is officially in recession. Economists and members of the ruling party are scrambling. What do these numbers mean for the future of New Zealand? Will the country be able to improve its economy? Let's find out. What happened to New Zealand's economy? A 2022 quarterly report showed that New Zealand's GDP had shrunk by 0.7%, based on the very definition of a recession. That is 2 consecutive economic contractions. The Kiwi State is up for some tough times ahead. New Zealand only barely met the technical criteria of recession. Many economists were hoping that the Kiwi State would pull through. However, others believed that it was very predictable. New Zealand dealt with severe weather conditions for the first 3 months of 2023. Cyclone hail struck between January 7th through the 12th. Gabrielle came quickly after, lasting between February 5th and 11th. The cyclones attacked some of New Zealand's key agricultural sites. What came next was predictable: a rise in interest rates. Food prices have continuously risen over the last few years in New Zealand. In fact, price hikes have followed after all 12 of the last meetings of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Grocery food prices shot up by 12%. Prices of fruits and vegetables went up by 18.4%. However, household expenses in total went down. The economic contraction was a blow to the Reserve Bank. They had estimated that the GDP would actually rise by 0.3% by March. The IMF made note of New Zealand's economic condition in its financial report. The report remarked how the state had gotten back up the fastest after COVID-19 spread. The government's many expenses had an impact, especially those for rehabilitation had a longer-lasting impact than expected. According to the report, New Zealand's economy wasn't allowed time to recoup. Economists knew that inflation rates would go up following the pandemic. They didn't know that cyclones Gabrielle and Hale were on the horizon. What ended up happening was the opposite. Inflation shot up again. This came largely as a result of New Zealand's $12 billion in cleanup costs after the cyclones. The generous government efforts came at the cost of overheating the economy. What is a technical recession? It's important to remember that New Zealand's economy isn't hanging on by a thread. The economy is indeed in recession based on the very definition of the term. It isn't, however, in complete disarray. If anything, employment rates have actually gone up in 2023. The central bank had previously claimed that it wanted a recession to happen. New Zealand's inflation rate reached 6.7% in 2022, compared to the central bank's 1 to 3% recommendation. The central bank then said they were engineering a recession to rein in inflation. However, the central bank made it clear that borrowing costs must stay high. This makes things difficult for the Labour Party and the National Party. The recession report came in June, and general elections were to be held in October that same year. Both parties offered Kiwis a lower cost of living should they be elected. Economists have labeled New Zealand's recession as a gentle one. However, the central bank wants things to stay the way they are for a while. This means that the cost of living will remain high. Elections forecast place the National Party as the winner. The party gained favor from the public after they promised to slash the rising cost of living. By taxing foreigners living in New Zealand, the National Party claimed that they'd reduce income taxes for citizens by taxing foreigners on buying property worth over 2 million New Zealand dollars. The Labour Party, however, argued that taxing foreigners would be insufficient, especially if the National Party wanted to stay true to its claim. Labour Party sinks to 6-year low in general elections. In 1993, New Zealand changed its system to a proportional representation government. However, 2020 saw the Labour Party earning an absolute majority with Jacinda Ardern. With Chris Hipkins replacing Ardern, it looks like times are changing in the Kiwi State. For the first time in several decades, New Zealand is headed towards a right-wing poised state. October's national election showed startling results. The National Party's vote share went up 39% compared to 26% in 2020. ACT retained 9% of the share. The Labour Party's ally, the Green Party, won 11% of the shares. The biggest dip, however, came for the Labour Party itself. The party went from 50% shares to only 27%. Ardern became a global icon. She was praised for the way that she safeguarded New Zealand during COVID-19. However, in January 2023, she stepped down, citing burnout. Some analysts, however, believe that there was another factor at play. Ardern stepped down at a time when her popularity had taken a massive dip, and it was all because of New Zealand's economic plight. Hipkins came onto the scene and promised to help the working-class people of New Zealand. Soon after, the opposition claimed that Hipkins had failed to bring the change he'd promised. This came with rising unaffordability and skyrocketing mortgage rates. So while the recession is only a technical one, it did have one major effect: New Zealand's seeing its most right-wing government for the first time in decades. Teacher strikes contributed to New Zealand's recession. The back-to-back cyclones and COVID-19 had a more obvious impact. However, many believe that there was another factor. In March, teachers took to the streets to protest against their paychecks. Inflation skyrocketed to 6.7% in 2023. However, educators' salaries were not adjusted. The ruling Labour Party offered low salaries to educators. Obviously, teachers' associations rejected them. The teachers' associations were more than reasonable with their demands. They countered the government's offer with one of their own. They said that educators would take an 11% rise in their salary spread over a period of 3 years. The adjusted salary would still, technically, be less than what they were owed. The government did virtually nothing to meet the staffing crisis. Surveys showed that a third of teaching positions were not paid, mostly because of their low salaries. Household expenses shot up by 7.7% in 2022. Unsurprisingly, teachers started to protest. On March 16th, middle school teachers held a protest. On March 29th, high school teachers held their own. There was a joint protest with 50,000 protesters. Independent protests, however, had about 20,000 protesters. According to strategists, the teacher strikes contributed to the shrinking economy. Educational expenses went down with the growing uncertainty of yet another protest. And it's not just the teachers, though. Staffing crisis and inadequate pay became a problem across all sectors. This included healthcare as well. Essentially, the Labour Party announced a $747 million defense budget in 2023. Altogether, New Zealand has contributed billions towards the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What does this mean for Australia? High-profile economists fear that Australia might be headed toward a recession too. After June's report, the chances of the Australian economy receding increased by 50%. Australian economists argue that things would be a lot different in Australia. One of the major reasons why is because of unemployment. The Kiwi State has an unemployment rate of 3.4% compared to Australia's 11%. Furthermore, the Reserve Bank of Australia is only at a cash rate of 4% compared to 5.5% of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. This means that they have a 1.5% leeway even now. Economists are warning Australians of a potential inflation hike. The June quarter showed Australia's GDP increased only by 0.4%. Economists termed it as a per capita recession. The 0.4% rise was only because of foreign investments. This included foreign businesses and scholars moving to Australia. However, the report also showed that households as a whole are spending less now. This might have something to do with the rising interest rates. More so, though, with Australia's power crisis. The country's facing the largest rates for household power in decades, and this prevents households from spending elsewhere. Household savings have gone down to 3.2%. That's the lowest it's ever been since the global financial crisis. Australia and New Zealand's economies are interconnected in several ways. They often mimic trends. Just before New Zealand's recession, they'd been experiencing the same things. Employment was only high because people were looking for jobs elsewhere. That is, to meet up with rising inflation, they'd been working with global companies, not the ones in New Zealand itself. Everything Australia's facing now was what New Zealand had to go through too. New Zealand's economy is improving. Grant Robertson, the New Zealand finance minister, claims that the condition is improving. Grant actually claimed that the June report was misrepresented. In reality, economic growth in the Kiwi State had increased by 1%. Recent data reveals no recession in the country earlier this year. The government's measures to improve the economy contributed to a high growth rate. The annual growth rate reached 3.2%, with the economy reaching $395 billion, exceeding its pre-COVID size. This positive outcome was confirmed by State NZ, which revised the March quarter number, affirming that there was no recession earlier in the year. The economy has now grown by 7.7% compared to the onset of the pandemic. New Zealand's economy is making a turnaround. Robertson highlighted that the country's quarterly economic growth of 0.9% compares favorably with other nations, including Australia, Canada, the Euro area, the UK, and the US. The services sector, 2/3 of economic activity, drove growth. especially in business services. Manufacturing also saw an increase. Disruptions caused by cyclones continue to impact the farming and forestry industries, though. Household spending rose by 0.4%. The export sector showed significant growth at 5%, with food and fiber export revenue surpassing initial forecasts by $1.2 billion. Robertson emphasized positive indicators such as employment growth exceeding forecasts, low unemployment, and rising wages. The economy benefits from a growing population, increased exports, and the return of tourist and international students. Looking ahead, Robertson highlighted positive forecasts from the Treasury, indicating average annual growth of 2.6%, the addition of over 100,000 jobs, and wages outpacing inflation. The Reserve Bank's suggestion that interest rates have peaked and inflation is expected to fall back under control was noted. The government is actively investing in the economy, allocating over $2.2 billion for the recovery and building from recent flooding and Cyclone Gabrielle. An additional $6 billion in initial funding is committed to a National Resilience Fund for long-term responses, including cost-sharing agreements with councils and infrastructure development. Do you think New Zealand's economy is really improving? Let us know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more.